The peaceful town of Millfield seemed like the last place where trouble would brew. But beneath its quaint exterior, a silent war was unfolding. For Eleanor Blackwood, a 56-year-old widow who had buried her husband just 6 months ago, life was about to take an unexpected turn. The local gang that had been terrorizing small businesses had set their sights on her modest gun shop, a legacy her husband had left behind. Little did they know that Eleanor was far from the vulnerable target they assumed. Behind her gentle smile and grief-worn eyes lay a military background and a determination that would soon shock the entire county. What happened when these ruffians demanded protection money from the seemingly helpless widow? They were about to discover her hidden arsenal, not just of weapons, but of courage, tactical brilliance, and an unbreakable spirit. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. April in Millfield, Massachusetts brought with it the scent of blooming cherry trees and a sense of renewal. But for Eleanor Blackwood, spring only emphasized what she had lost. 6 months had passed since she'd buried Frank, her husband of 30 years, after his sudden heart attack. Their gun shop, Blackwood Firearms, stood as both her livelihood and the last physical connection to the man she had loved since high school. The bell above the shop door chimed as Eleanor finished organizing a display of hunting rifles. Looking up, she spotted Hank Miller, the local mail carrier, and a friend of Frank's, standing awkwardly at the counter. "Morning, Hank," Eleanor said, tucking a strand of her silver-streaked brown hair behind her ear. "What brings you by today? Need more ammo for that weekend shooting club?" Hank shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting around the meticulously organized shop. "Not today, Ellie. Just checking in to see how you're holding up." Eleanor had grown accustomed to this, the concerned looks, the careful questions. The town had been kind after Frank's death, but their kindness often came wrapped in doubt about her ability to manage alone. "I'm fine, Hank. Business is steady. I'm getting by." Hank nodded, then leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Listen, I heard some talk while delivering on the west side. The Corelli brothers have been expanding their protection racket. 3 businesses got hit last week." Eleanor's expression hardened. The Corelli brothers, Vincent and Anthony, had moved to Millfield 2 years ago, gradually building a network of intimidation and extortion that the local police seemed powerless to stop. "Thanks for the heads up, Hank. But this is a gun shop, not a bakery. I don't think they'd be stupid enough to try anything here." Hank's face remained grave. "Just be careful, Ellie. These guys don't care what you sell. They're targeting everyone, especially those they think won't fight back." After Hank left, Eleanor locked the front door and walked to the back office. The room was small but functional, with file cabinets lining one wall and Frank's old desk dominating the center. She sank into the worn leather chair and opened the bottom drawer, pulling out a worn leather-bound journal. Inside were detailed accounts of every transaction, every supplier, and every regular customer, all in Frank's meticulous handwriting. But behind these business records lay something else, a series of notes about local criminals, suspicious customers, and potential threats. Frank had been more than just a gun shop owner. He'd been a retired police detective who never quite stopped investigating. Eleanor flipped to a page marked Corelli and found detailed notes about the brothers' history, their known associates, and suspected illegal operations. Frank had been tracking them long before his death, concerned about their growing influence in Millfield. "You were always 3 steps ahead, weren't you, Frank?" she whispered, running her fingers over his handwriting. What the town didn't know, what even Frank hadn't fully appreciated, was that Eleanor had her own history with danger. Before meeting Frank, she had served 8 years in Army intelligence, specializing in threat assessment and tactical response. Her quiet demeanor and current role as the widow running her husband's shop masked a woman who had once navigated war zones and coordinated high-risk operations. A sharp knock on the shop's front door pulled Eleanor from her thoughts. Through the glass, she could see two men in expensive suits, one tall and lean, the other shorter and powerfully built. The Corelli brothers arrived sooner than expected. Eleanor slipped Frank's journal into a hidden compartment beneath the desk, straightened her simple blue cardigan, and moved to the front of the store. She unlocked the door but stood blocking the entrance. "We're closed for lunch," she said, her voice even. "You can come back at once." Vincent Corelli, the taller of the two, smiled with practiced charm. His dark hair was perfectly styled, and his suit probably cost more than Eleanor made in a month. "Mrs. Blackwood, I presume. We're not here to shop. We'd like to discuss a business proposition with you." "I don't take business meetings during lunch," Eleanor replied, maintaining her position in the doorway. Anthony, the shorter brother with a boxer's build and a scar across his left eyebrow, stepped forward. "It'll only take a few minutes of your time, Ma'am. It would be in your best interest to hear us out." The threat was thinly veiled, but Eleanor had faced down worse intimidation tactics. Still, refusing them outright would only escalate the situation. Better to understand their approach first. "5 minutes," she said, stepping aside to let them enter. The brothers walked in, Anthony immediately beginning to wander around the shop, examining the merchandise, while Vincent maintained eye contact with Eleanor. "Impressive inventory," Vincent commented, gesturing around the store. "Your husband built quite a business here." "He did," Eleanor agreed, moving behind the counter where she could keep both men in her line of sight. "But you didn't come to admire his work," Vincent chuckled. "Direct. I appreciate that." He adjusted his gold cufflinks before continuing. "Millfield is changing, Mrs. Blackwood. Small businesses like yours are vulnerable to unfortunate incidents. Break-ins, vandalism, inventory damage. It would be a shame if anything happened to your husband's legacy." Eleanor watched as Anthony picked up a hunting knife, testing its edge against his thumb. "And I suppose you're offering to prevent these unfortunate incidents? For a reasonable monthly fee, we guarantee your shop remains trouble-free. Think of it as specialized insurance. $2,000 a month for complete peace of mind." Eleanor didn't flinch at the exorbitant amount. "That's quite a premium for insurance I didn't ask for." Anthony set down the knife and moved closer. "Many businesses in town have already seen the value in our services. The Mitchell's hardware store, the corner cafe, they're all protected now." "Protected from whom?" Eleanor asked, though she already knew the answer. Vincent's smile didn't waver. "Let's just say there are elements in town that don't appreciate the quiet charm of Millfield the way we do. We keep those elements in check for our clients." Eleanor studied both men carefully. Vincent was clearly the businessman handling negotiations with a veneer of respectability. Anthony was the enforcer, his barely contained aggression evident in every movement. They were well practiced at this routine. "I need time to consider your offer," she said finally. Vincent's expression hardened slightly. "Of course, business decisions shouldn't be rushed. We'll give you until tomorrow." He placed a business card on the counter. "Call this number when you've made your decision, but I should mention, our rates increase after the initial offer period." As they turned to leave, Anthony paused, looking back at Eleanor. "Your husband had quite a collection of firearms here. Shame he's not around to use them anymore." The bell chimed as they exited, leaving Eleanor alone in the suddenly silent shop. She picked up Vincent's card, a simple black design with only a phone number embossed in silver. No name, no business, nothing that could directly tie them to extortion. Eleanor locked the door behind them and flipped the closed sign. Instead of returning to the office, she moved to the storage room at the back of the shop. Using a key from around her neck, she unlocked a reinforced door that led to a small but comprehensive gun vault. Frank had installed it years ago to store their most valuable inventory and personal collection. Inside, she bypassed the racks of firearms and went directly to a digital safe embedded in the wall. After entering a 10-digit code, the safe opened to reveal not weapons, but a collection of flash drives, passports, and a satellite phone. Eleanor removed one of the drives and a small notebook, then returned to the office. She booted up an encrypted laptop that Frank had kept separate from the shop's main computer system and inserted the drive. Files appeared on screen, surveillance footage from cameras hidden throughout the shop and outside the building. Frank had installed them as a security measure, but Eleanor had upgraded the system after his death. She quickly located today's footage and downloaded the brothers' visit, making sure their faces and conversation were clearly captured. In the E2 notebook, she wrote the date and time of the visit, along with detailed descriptions of both men and quotes from their conversation. At the bottom, she added, initial contact made, threat level moderate, timeline 24 hours to respond. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Eleanor then picked up her personal cell phone and dialed a number from memory. Major Reynolds, answered a gruff voice after 2 rings. It's Blackwood, Eleanor replied. I might need to cash in that favor sooner than expected. There was a pause on the other end. Ellie, it's been years. What's going on? Local trouble. Nothing I can't handle yet, but I want to establish a contingency. Are you still with the JAG Corps? Retired 2 years ago. Private practice now, but I still have connections. What kind of trouble are we talking about? Eleanor gave him a concise summary of the Corelli brothers and their extortion attempt. Reynolds let out a low whistle. Organized crime in Millfield? Times have changed. You've documented everything, I assume? Of course, Eleanor confirmed. Smart. Keep doing that. I know some people in the FBI's organized crime division who might be interested, especially if these guys are operating across state lines. But they'll need more than one shakedown attempt to move on it. I understand. I'm not looking for an immediate intervention, just establishing channels in case things escalate. Always the strategist, Reynolds remarked. What about local law enforcement? Eleanor sighed. Sheriff Dawson is a good man, but he's undermanned and overly cautious. The Corellis have been careful to stay just below the radar. Nothing that would justify a major investigation. And you? How are you holding up without Frank? The question caught Eleanor off guard. Most people asked it out of obligation or pity, but from Reynolds, who had known them both during their service years, it carried genuine concern. I miss him, she admitted, but I'm managing the shop, keeping his legacy alive. He'd be proud, Reynolds said, but he'd also tell you to be careful. These aren't insurgents or foreign operatives, Ellie. These are criminals who think they own a small town. Different rules apply. I remember the rules, Major. I also remember how to bend them when necessary. Reynolds laughed. That you do? All right, I'll make some calls, put some feelers out about the Corelli brothers. In the meantime, don't do anything I wouldn't do. That still leaves me a lot of options, Eleanor replied with a small smile. After ending the call, Eleanor sat back in Frank's chair, considering her options. The Corellis would return tomorrow expecting payment or at least a negotiation. Refusing outright would likely lead to some form of retaliation, property damage at minimum, possibly escalating to physical threats. Paying would only validate their approach and mark her as an ongoing source of income. She needed a third option. Opening Frank's journal again, she reviewed his notes on the brothers' operation. According to his investigation, they had started their protection racket with small businesses on the outskirts of town, before gradually moving inward. They typically targeted businesses owned by women, the elderly, or immigrants first, those they perceived as less likely to resist or report them. Frank had also noted patterns in their retaliation against those who refused to pay. Broken windows, The first night, inventory damage the second, and direct physical intimidation by the third day. They moved quickly to establish dominance, but were careful to avoid actions that would trigger immediate police response. Eleanor closed the journal and walked through the shop, considering its layout with fresh eyes. The large front windows were vulnerable. The back entrance was reinforced, but could still be breached with enough determination. The alarm system was good but standard. She would need to make some adjustments tonight. As evening approached, Eleanor closed the shop as usual at 6 p.m. She spoke briefly with Sheriff Dawson when he stopped by on his regular patrol, mentioning, casually, that she had some interesting customers today, but providing no details that would force him to take official action. After he left, instead of heading to her small house 2 blocks away, Eleanor remained in the shop. She moved methodically from point to point, installing small modifications to the existing security system. Pressure sensors under specific floorboards, motion detectors with customized sensitivity settings, and additional cameras in blind spots. From a locked cabinet beneath the cash register, she retrieved several items that weren't on any inventory list. Military-grade zip ties, a taser disguised as a flashlight, and a canister of specialized smoke designed to disorient without causing permanent damage. By midnight, the shop had been transformed into a carefully crafted tactical environment that looked exactly the same to the casual observer. Eleanor then made one final preparation, calling 3 trusted friends from Frank's days on the police force. She explained the situation and what she anticipated might happen in the coming days. "I'm not asking you to intervene officially," she told Jim Parker, a retired detective who had been Frank's partner for 15 years. "Just be ready to witness and document if needed." "The Corellis have been a growing problem," Jim agreed. "Dawson's hands are tied without solid evidence or witnesses willing to testify, which is why I need reliable observers, not active participants," Eleanor explained. "If something happens, I want unimpeachable testimony about who initiated the conflict." After finalizing arrangements with her impromptu surveillance team, Eleanor finally returned home. She slept soundly despite the looming confrontation, a skill she had developed during her military years. Rest when possible, because you never know when the next opportunity will come. Morning arrived with a steady rain that kept casual shoppers away. Eleanor opened on schedule, going through her normal routine while remaining hyper-aware of her surroundings. The shop remained quiet throughout the morning, with only 2 regular customers stopping by for ammunition. At precisely noon, the bell above the door chimed. Vincent Corelli entered alone this time, dressed in a charcoal suit with a navy tie, looking more like a corporate executive than a criminal. He shook raindrops from his umbrella before closing it with practiced elegance. "Mrs. Blackwood," he greeted her with a nod. "I trust you've had time to consider our arrangement." Eleanor folded her hands on the counter. "I have. I appreciate your concern for my security, but I must decline your offer." Vincent's smile didn't waver, but his eyes hardened. "I understand this may seem expensive, but consider it an investment in your future. Perhaps we could discuss more manageable amount for a widow operating alone." The condescension in his tone was deliberate, a reminder of what he perceived as her vulnerability. Eleanor matched his smile with one of her own. "My decision isn't about the money, Mr. Corelli. It's about principle. This shop has operated independently for 25 years. I intend to maintain that tradition." "Principles are admirable," Vincent replied, adjusting his cufflinks, a nervous tell that his calm demeanor didn't fully mask. "But they don't protect inventory or prevent accidents. My brother and I would hate to see anything happen to this place." "As would I," Eleanor agreed, "which is why I've taken my own security measures." Vincent's expression flickered with momentary surprise before he regained his composure. "Independent security is rarely as effective as our services, but I respect your decision, Mrs. Blackwood." He placed his business card on the counter again. "Should you reconsider, our offer remains open, though as mentioned, the rate increases after today." As he turned to leave, Eleanor called after him. "Mr. Corelli." He paused, looking back. "I should mention that I've documented our conversations and shared them with several interested parties, purely as my own form of insurance, you understand." For a brief moment, genuine anger flashed across Vincent's face before his mask of civility returned. "That seems unnecessarily adversarial, Mrs. Blackwood. We're simply businessmen offering a service." "Of course," Eleanor replied, "and I'm simply a businesswoman protecting my interests." After Vincent left, Eleanor watched through the window as he made a phone call while walking to his car. His gestures were animated, his expression darkening as he spoke. She had just escalated the situation deliberately, knowing that a direct challenge would force the Corellis to respond or risk appearing weak to other businesses they were extorting. The question now was how and when they would retaliate, and whether her preparations would be enough to turn their attack into an opportunity to expose their operation once and for all. The afternoon passed uneventfully, but Eleanor knew better than to assume the Corellis had accepted her refusal. As closing time approached, she contacted her 3 observers, confirming they were in position around the shop. Jim Parker was parked across the street in his weathered pickup, ostensibly reading a newspaper. Maria Delgado, a former military police officer who had settled in Millfield after retirement, had taken a table at the cafe on the corner with a clear view of the shop's entrance. The third, Curtis Washington, a cybersecurity expert who had helped Frank upgrade the shop's systems, was monitoring the security feeds remotely. "All quiet so far," Jim reported when Eleanor called, "but I've seen Anthony Corelli's black Escalade circle the block twice in the last hour." "They're assessing the situation," Eleanor replied. "Standard procedure before a strike. They'll want to know if I'm alone, if there are any obvious security measures they missed yesterday." "You sound like you're back in the field," Jim remarked. "Some skills you never lose," Eleanor said. "I'll close up at the usual time. They probably won't move until after midnight." After locking up, Eleanor went through her evening routine for any watching eyes, turning off the main lights, checking the front door, and walking the 2 blocks to her house. Once home, she ate a light dinner, changed into dark clothing, and slipped out through the back door, using the alleyways and side streets she had mapped out years ago when she and Frank first moved to Millfield. Eleanor made her way back to the shop unobserved. She entered through a concealed access point in the rear loading dock that wasn't on any building plans, a modification Frank had installed for emergencies. The shop was dark and silent as she moved to the security monitoring station hidden in a false wall of the storage room. The screens showed empty streets outside, though Eleanor noticed a van parked 2 blocks down that hadn't been there earlier, likely the Corellis' backup. At 11:42 p.m., her phone vibrated with a text from Curtis. "Movement at northeast corner. 2 figures approaching the rear entrance." Eleanor switched to that camera feed and watched as 2 men in dark clothing examined the back door. They weren't the Corelli brothers. These were hired muscle professionals based on their methodical approach to the building. One placed a small device against the electronic lock while the other kept watch. "They're bypassing the standard alarm," Eleanor murmured to herself, unsurprised. What would surprise them was that the standard alarm wasn't the only one protecting the shop. She tapped a quick message to her surveillance team. "Phase 1 beginning. Maintain positions." The lock on the back door disengaged with a soft click that Eleanor could hear through the building's silence. The men entered cautiously, using small tactical flashlights to navigate the storage area. They moved with practiced efficiency, clearly there for a specific purpose rather than random vandalism. Eleanor tracked their movement through the shop via the security feeds, noting how they avoided the main displays and headed directly for the gun cases containing the most valuable merchandise. These weren't opportunistic thieves. They had been briefed on the shop's layout and inventory. The taller of the two produced a glass cutter and began working on the display case containing several high-end handguns while his partner stood guard. Eleanor waited until both were fully committed to their task before pressing a sequence of buttons on the security console. Throughout the shop, subtle mechanical sounds whispered as reinforced shutters silently descended over the windows and doors. The emergency lights remained off, but the men noticed the change immediately, their flashlight beams darting around as they registered they were now locked in. "What the hell?" the shorter man hissed, moving toward the front entrance, only to find it secured by a steel shutter. Jackson said nothing about advanced security, his partner replied, reaching for his cell phone. "No signal. They must have a jammer." Eleanor smiled. Curtis had activated the signal blocker remotely as soon as she'd given the alert. The men were now cut off from whoever had sent them. "Check the back door," the taller man ordered. "I'll finish here and grab what we can." As the shorter man headed back toward the storage room, Eleanor moved silently through a hidden access panel behind the ammunition shelves. Years of military training had taught her how to move without sound, and Frank's paranoid attention to building security had created numerous concealed passages throughout the shop. The shorter intruder reached the back door, finding it locked by the same security shutters that covered the windows. "We're sealed in," he called to his partner, voice rising with the first edges of panic. Eleanor positioned herself in the shadows near the main counter as the men regrouped in the center of the shop. "There has to be a control panel," the taller one said, sweeping his flashlight across the walls. "Find it, and we can override the system." "And if we can't," his partner asked, "then we do what Jackson paid us for. Trash the place, take what we can carry, and wait for them to open in the morning." Eleanor had heard enough to confirm her suspicions. These men were hired to make an example of her, likely the first stage of escalation after her refusal to pay. She pressed another sequence on the small remote control in her palm. The shop's emergency lights activated suddenly, bathing the space in harsh white light that momentarily blinded the intruders. As they shielded their eyes, a recorded message played over the shop's speaker system. "Security breach detected. Law enforcement has been notified. Please remain where you are." It was a bluff. She hadn't called the police yet, but the men didn't know that. The shorter one immediately headed for the back door again, pulling desperately at the security gate while his partner drew a handgun from his waistband. "Who's there?" the armed man demanded, pivoting toward the source of the recorded message. "Show yourself." Eleanor pressed another button on her remote. The lights went out completely, plunging the shop back into darkness for 3 seconds before red emergency lighting activated, creating pools of crimson illumination that distorted shapes and shadows throughout the space. "You're trespassing." Eleanor's voice echoed from multiple speakers, making it impossible to pinpoint her location. "This is private property." "Lady, you're making a big mistake," the armed intruder called out, his gun tracking from shadow to shadow. "We're just the beginning. Back off now, pay what you owe, and maybe this ends here." "I don't respond well to threats," Eleanor replied, her voice still masked by the distributed speaker system. "Put down the weapon, and I'll let you leave with the police instead of an ambulance." The man laughed, a harsh sound in the red-tinged darkness. "You picked the wrong people to defy, widow. The Corellis don't take no for an answer." There it was, the explicit connection she needed. Eleanor activated her phone's recording function, capturing the conversation. "I'm giving you one last chance," she announced. "Surrender now." The armed man fired in the direction of her voice, the gunshot deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet embedded itself in the wall well away from Eleanor's actual position. "That's your answer," he shouted. "Come out now, or the next one finds you." Eleanor had expected this response. Most hired muscles relied on intimidation first, violence. Second, now that he had escalated to gunfire, she could respond in kind under clear self-defense. She pressed a final button on her remote. From concealed nozzles throughout the ceiling, a fine mist began to spray into the air. Not tear gas or a harmful chemical, but a specialized compound Frank had acquired through his law enforcement connections. The substance was designed to temporarily impair vision and coordination without causing permanent damage, similar to what police used for crowd control, but more targeted. The effect was almost immediate. The armed intruder began coughing, his aim becoming erratic as he fired another wild shot. His partner stumbled toward the front door, disoriented and struggling to breathe normally. Eleanor slipped on a tactical mask that protected her from the compound and moved swiftly from her hiding place. The armed man sensed movement and swung toward her, but his reactions were slowed by the chemical. Before he could aim, Eleanor struck his wrist with a tactical baton she had concealed in her sleeve, causing him to drop the gun with a howl of pain. A swift kick to the back of his knee brought him down, and Eleanor quickly secured his hands behind his back with a zip tie. The second man was still conscious but barely standing, leaning against the front door as he tried to clear his vision. "What did you do to us?" he gasped as Eleanor approached. "Nothing permanent," she assured him, securing his hands as well. "Unlike what you planned to do to my shop." With both intruders restrained, Eleanor activated the ventilation system to clear the air and made a call, not to 911, but directly to Sheriff Dawson's cell phone. "Tom, it's Eleanor Blackwood. I've had a break-in at the shop. 2 men, 1 armed. Yes, they're subdued. No, I'm not hurt." She paused, listening. "That won't be necessary. I have them secured. You might want to bring a deputy, though, and call Agent Rivera at the FBI field office in Boston. Tell him it's related to the Corelli investigation he mentioned last month." As she ended the call, Eleanor noticed one of the intruders staring at her with wide eyes. "Who the hell are you, lady?" he asked, bewilderment evident in his voice. Eleanor knelt to meet his gaze. "Just a widow protecting what's hers." Within 15 minutes, Sheriff Dawson arrived with 2 deputies. He surveyed the scene with a mixture of amazement and concern. "Ellie, you could have been killed," he said, watching as his deputies read the intruders their rights. "Armed confrontation is exactly what I've told everyone in town to avoid." "I didn't seek confrontation, Tom," Eleanor replied calmly. "They broke into my shop with an illegal weapon and fired at me. The security system worked exactly as designed." Dawson raised an eyebrow at the security system comment, but didn't press further. After 20 years in Millfield, he knew Frank Blackwood had been unconventional in his approach to security, and Eleanor apparently shared that trait. "The FBI contact you mentioned. Is this connected to something bigger?" Eleanor nodded. "The men admitted they were sent by the Corellis. It's all on the security recordings. This wasn't random, Tom. It was retaliation, because I refused to pay protection money yesterday." Dawson's expression darkened. "The Corellis, again. We've had suspicions, but no proof. No one willing to testify." He gestured to the restrained men. "These 2 might change that equation." "They might," Eleanor agreed. "Especially when they realize how much prison time they're facing for armed breaking and entering, attempted assault with a deadly weapon, and criminal conspiracy." One of the intruders, overhearing this, paled visibly. "Hey, we were just supposed to rough up the place a little. Jackson never said anything about shooting anyone." Eleanor and Dawson exchanged knowing glances. The man was already looking to cut a deal. "Jackson?" Dawson asked casually. "That would be Jackson Myers, Vincent Corelli's right-hand man." The intruder fell silent, realizing he'd said too much already. By morning, the attempted break-in at Blackwood Firearms was the talk of Millfield. Eleanor reopened the shop on schedule, fielding concerned questions from customers with reassurances that everything was under control. What the townspeople didn't know was that while she maintained her normal routine, a much larger operation was unfolding behind the scenes. FBI agent Miguel Rivera arrived from Boston shortly before noon, meeting Eleanor in the shop's back office. He was a compact man with sharp eyes and the careful movements of someone accustomed to dangerous situations. "Mrs. Blackwood," he greeted her with a firm handshake. "Sheriff Dawson filled me in on last night's excitement. Impressive work." "Thank you," Eleanor replied, "though I suspect you're more interested in the connection to the Corellis than in my security measures." Rivera smiled thinly. "We've had the brothers on our radar for some time. Their operation extends beyond Millfield. Protection rackets in 3 counties, suspected ties to larger criminal enterprises in Boston and New York. But they've been careful, insulated. No direct evidence connecting them to the crimes. Until now," Eleanor noted. "Until now," Rivera agreed. "One of your intruders, a man named Derek Sloan, is already talking. Seems he's facing his 3rd strike and looking at serious time. He's offering details on the entire Corelli operation in exchange for consideration." Eleanor leaned back in her chair. "So my refusal to pay worked out better than expected." "It did, though I have to ask, did you anticipate this outcome? Setting up a trap for hired muscle isn't standard procedure for most shop owners." Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "Let's just say I have experience assessing threats and planning appropriate responses." Rivera studied her for a moment before nodding. "Major Eleanor Blackwood, Army Intelligence, retired 1992. I did my homework before driving out here." He smiled at her surprised expression. "Your husband wasn't the only one with investigative skills. Then you know I was protecting my property using legal security measures," Eleanor said carefully. "Absolutely," Rivera agreed. "And providing us with an opportunity we've been waiting for. The question now is what happens next. The Corellis won't take this lightly. 2 of their men in custody, 1 talking to the FBI. They'll either back off completely or escalate dramatically," Eleanor finished. "I'm betting on the latter. Vincent Corelli struck me as a man who doesn't accept defiance, especially from someone he perceives as vulnerable." Rivera nodded. "Our assessment as well, which leaves us with an opportunity." "You want to use me as bait," Eleanor stated, "not a question." "I was going to phrase it more diplomatically, but essentially yes. With your cooperation, we could set up a sting operation. The Corellis will almost certainly make another move against you, possibly coming themselves this time instead of sending hired help. If we can catch them in the act of extortion or violence, you can bring down their entire operation," Eleanor concluded. "I'm in." Rivera looked surprised at her quick agreement. "Mrs. Blackwood, I should emphasize the potential danger. Vincent and Anthony Corelli aren't just white-collar criminals. They've been implicated in at least 2 disappearances of people who crossed them. We would have agents nearby, but there's still significant risk." Eleanor smiled. "Agent Rivera, did your homework include my operational record in Beirut in 1986 or Panama in 1989? Rivera's expression shifted from concern to something approaching respect. "It did not include those details, no." "Then trust me when I say I've handled more dangerous men than the Corelli brothers." She rose from her chair and moved to the gun safe in the corner, spinning the dial with practiced ease. The heavy door swung open to reveal an organized collection of firearms. She selected a compact 9mm handgun and checked it with the efficiency of someone who had done so thousands of times. "I have a concealed carry permit," she informed Rivera as she holstered the weapon beneath her cardigan. "And unlike many who obtain them, I maintain proficiency. Monthly range practice, tactical, refreshers twice a year." Frank insisted, and I agreed. Rivera nodded slowly. "All right, we'll set up surveillance immediately and have a tactical team on standby. The Corellis typically move quickly after a setback to reassert dominance. I'd expect contact within 48 hours. Sooner, Eleanor predicted. Their entire business model relies on creating examples of those who resist. After last night's failure, they'll want to respond decisively. As if on cue, the phone on the desk rang. Eleanor glanced at the caller ID, unknown number, and gave Rivera a meaningful look before answering the speaker. "Blackwood Firearms," she answered calmly. "Mrs. Blackwood." Vincent Corelli's voice was smooth as ever, but with an edge that hadn't been there before. "I've just heard about the unfortunate incident at your shop last night. How terribly distressing for you, Mr. Corelli," Eleanor replied. "What a coincidence that you should call. I was just discussing that incident with some associates." A moment of silence followed before Vincent continued, his tone hardening. "It seems you misunderstood the nature of our previous conversation. My offer was not optional, merely presented as such out of professional courtesy." "I understood perfectly," Eleanor countered, "and my answer remains the same." "Perhaps we should discuss this in person," Vincent suggested. "Business matters are always better settled face to face." Eleanor caught Rivera's nod. "I agree. Why don't you come by the shop after closing today, 6:30? "My brother and I will be there," Vincent confirmed. "I'm confident we can reach an understanding that satisfies everyone." After the call ended, Rivera immediately contacted his team to arrange surveillance and backup for the evening meeting. Eleanor returned to the shop floor, helping customers and maintaining normal operations, while mentally preparing for the confrontation to come. When closing time arrived, she locked the front door and drew the blinds as usual, though she left. The open sign illuminated. Rivera and two other agents had set up surveillance from the bookstore across the street, while additional teams were positioned in vehicles at both ends of the block. At precisely 6:30, a black Mercedes pulled up in front of the shop. Vincent and Anthony Corelli emerged, Vincent in his customary tailored suit, Anthony in more casual attire that didn't quite conceal the bulge of a shoulder holster. Eleanor unlocked the door to admit them, her own concealed weapon a reassuring weight against her side. "Mrs. Blackwood," Vincent greeted her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Thank you for agreeing to meet." "Let's get on with it," Anthony interjected, his patience clearly thin. "We're done playing games with this woman," Eleanor gestured toward the counter at the back of the shop. "Shall we discuss your business proposition then?" As they moved deeper into the store, away from the windows, Vincent's demeanor shifted. The veneer of politeness fell away, replaced by cold calculation. "You've caused us considerable inconvenience, Mrs. Blackwood," he said. "Two of our associates arrested, potential investigations into our legitimate business concerns. This situation has become unnecessarily complicated." "I'm sorry to hear that," Eleanor replied, her tone making it clear she was anything but sorry. "Perhaps you should reconsider your business model." Anthony stepped forward, patience exhausted. "Enough talk. Here's how this works now. You sign over ownership of this shop to us as compensation for our troubles. We let you walk away. Otherwise—" He opened his jacket enough to reveal his holstered handgun. "That sounds like a threat," Eleanor observed calmly. "It's reality," Vincent corrected. "You're alone, outnumbered, and out of options. The papers are already drawn up." He removed a document from his inner pocket and placed it on the counter. "Sign, and this ends peacefully." Eleanor looked at the transfer documents, then back at the brothers. "I'm afraid I can't do that. This shop is not for sale." Anthony's hand moved toward his weapon, but Vincent held up a restraining hand. "Mrs. Blackwood, I don't think you understand the situation. This isn't a negotiation." "On that we agree," Eleanor said, her voice hardening. "This isn't a negotiation. It's an arrest in progress." The brothers exchanged confused glances, and in that moment of hesitation, Eleanor pressed a button beneath the counter. Throughout the shop, previously concealed panels slid open to reveal FBI agents with weapons trained on the Corellis. Vincent and Anthony Corelli, Agent Rivera announced as he emerged from his hiding place. "You're under arrest for extortion, conspiracy, and attempted coercion. Please keep your hands where we can see them." Anthony reached for his gun anyway, pure reflex overriding judgment. Before he could clear the holster, Eleanor had drawn her own weapon and aimed it steadily at his chest. "I wouldn't," she advised quietly. The look of utter disbelief on Anthony's face might have been comical under different circumstances. Slowly, he raised his hands in surrender. As the agents moved in to handcuff the brothers, Vincent stared at Eleanor with a mixture of rage and reluctant respect. "Who are you?" he demanded. "No ordinary shopkeeper sets up something like this." Eleanor holstered her weapon and met his gaze evenly. "I told you from the beginning, Mr. Corelli, I'm a businesswoman protecting my interests. You just underestimated what that meant." The arrest of Vincent and Anthony Corelli sent shockwaves through Millfield. By morning, news vans from Boston had descended on the quiet town, reporters eager to cover the story of a local widow who had helped bring down a criminal operation that had eluded law enforcement for years. Eleanor kept the shop closed, the blinds drawn against the curious eyes and camera lenses. She sat in Frank's office, reviewing the previous night's events with Agent Rivera and Sheriff Dawson. "The district attorney is ecstatic," Rivera informed her, passing over a cup of coffee. "Between the surveillance footage, audio recordings, and testimony from the hired men, we have an airtight case against the Corellis for the local extortion charges." "And that's just the beginning," Dawson added. "Based on what Sloan told us, the FBI is getting warrants for the Corellis' financial records, properties, and communications. This could unravel operations across 3 states. Eleanor nodded, satisfied but not celebrating. Years of military and intelligence work had taught her that victory rarely came without consequences. What about retaliation? The Corellis may be in custody, but organizations like theirs don't typically operate in isolation. Rivera exchanged a glance with Dawson. "That's our primary concern at this point. The brothers have connections to larger criminal networks in Boston and Providence. Our intelligence suggests they operate with considerable autonomy, but they do answer to someone higher up the chain." "Marcus Vega," Eleanor said quietly. Both men stared at her in surprise. "How do you know that name?" Rivera asked, leaning forward. Eleanor rose and moved to Frank's filing cabinet, unlocking the bottom drawer with a key she kept around her neck. She removed a thick file folder labeled Northeastern Operations and placed it on the desk. "My husband didn't retire from police work completely," she explained, opening the folder to reveal meticulously organized notes, photographs, and diagrams. He continued investigating independently, focusing on organized crime moving into rural areas. The Corellis were part of a larger expansion strategy orchestrated by Vega's organization. Rivera studied the materials with growing amazement. "This is incredibly comprehensive. Some of this information isn't even in our databases." He looked up at Eleanor. "Was your husband working with any federal agencies?" "Not officially," Eleanor replied. "After his heart attack scare 5 years ago, he was forced to retire from active duty. But he maintained contacts in various departments, traded information when it served mutual interests." Frank believed crime flourished in the shadows of jurisdiction, the gray areas between local, state, and federal responsibility. Dawson picked up a surveillance photo showing Vincent Corelli meeting with a distinguished older man on a Boston waterfront. "Is this Vega?" Eleanor nodded. "Marcus Vega, former lieutenant for the Castillo cartel, now running his own operation. He prefers to maintain distance between himself and direct criminal activity, uses intermediaries like the Corellis to establish local control, then gradually consolidates into legitimate businesses for laundering operations. Rivera stared at her. Mrs. Blackwood, with all due respect, this level of intelligence gathering and analysis is what I was trained to do, Eleanor finished for him. Before I married Frank, I spent 8 years in Army intelligence. Pattern recognition, threat assessment, strategic predictions. Those skills don't disappear just because you hang up the uniform. The FBI agent shook his head, impressed. Between your military background and your husband's police work, the Corellis never stood a chance, did they? A small smile touched Eleanor's lips. They made a fundamental error in target selection. They assumed a widow running a gun shop was vulnerable, isolated. They never questioned why a small-town gun shop had security measures that would make some embassies envious. Sheriff Dawson chuckled. Frank always was paranoid about security. I used to give him grief about it. Not paranoid, Eleanor corrected. Prepared. There's a difference. Rivera closed the folder and regarded Eleanor thoughtfully. We need to discuss your security going forward. The Corellis will remain in custody through their trial, but Vega won't take this disruption to his plans lightly. Once he realizes the extent of the evidence we've gathered, I'll become a target, Eleanor concluded, unperturbed by the prospect. I suspected as much. We can arrange protective custody, Rivera offered. Relocate you temporarily until the immediate threat passes. Eleanor shook her head firmly. I'm not leaving my home or this shop. Frank built this business from nothing. It's his legacy, and I won't abandon it out of fear. I expected you'd say that, Rivera sighed. In that case, we'll establish a protection detail. Agents positioned nearby, regular patrols, direct line. To our field office. I appreciate the thought, Agent Rivera, but a visible protection detail would only disrupt business and advertise vulnerability. Eleanor moved to the shop's security console and brought up a series of views showing the surrounding streets. I have comprehensive surveillance covering a 2-block radius, motion sensors on all approach routes, silent alarms connected directly to both local and federal response teams. She turned to face the two men. I'm not being reckless or overconfident. I respect the threat and have planned accordingly. The best protection isn't a reactive force, but a proactive security posture that makes me too difficult a target to pursue. Rivera studied her for a long moment before nodding reluctantly. You've clearly given this considerable thought. I still want to station undercover agents in the vicinity, but we'll be discreet. That's acceptable, Eleanor agreed, and I'd welcome a direct line to your tactical response team. After finalizing security arrangements, Sheriff Dawson departed to handle the media inquiries that had overwhelmed his small department. Rivera remained behind, helping Eleanor organize Frank's intelligence materials for official processing. You know, the FBI agent remarked as they worked, we have positions for people with your particular skill set. Consulting roles, intelligence, analysis, training, Eleanor smiled. Are you offering me a job, Agent Rivera? More like recognizing untapped potential, he replied. Seems a waste to have someone with your capabilities running a small-town gun shop. This small-town gun shop was my husband's pride and joy, Eleanor said, her tone softening, and it serves a purpose beyond commerce. Frank believed strongly in responsible gun ownership, in creating a space where people could learn proper, handling safety and respect for firearms. She ran her hand along the weathered edge of Frank's desk. Besides, I've had my fill of official operations and bureaucratic constraints. I prefer the freedom to make my own decisions, live by my own judgment. Rivera nodded in understanding. Fair enough. But if you ever change your mind, you'll be the first to know, Eleanor assured him. After Rivera departed, Eleanor finally ventured out to face the reporters gathered in front of the shop. She gave a brief statement emphasizing community solidarity against criminal intimidation rather than her personal role in the arrests. When questioned about her background or how she had managed to outmaneuver experienced criminals, she deflected with practiced ease. "I'm just a shopkeeper who refused to be bullied," she told the cameras with a modest smile that revealed nothing of her military past or intelligence training. Anyone would have done the same to protect their livelihood. By afternoon, the media frenzy had begun to dissipate as newer stories drew attention elsewhere. Eleanor reopened the shop, greeted by a steady stream of local customers who came as much to express support as to make purchases. "You've become quite the local hero," remarked Ellen Dawson, the sheriff's wife, as she stopped by with a homemade casserole. "The whole town's talking about how you stood up to those criminals." Eleanor accepted the dish with genuine gratitude. "People tend to exaggerate. I just did what was necessary." "Don't downplay it," Helen insisted. "You did what the rest of us were too scared to do. The Mitchells, the Patels at the corner market, even old Jenkins at the hardware store, they were all paying those thugs. You gave everyone courage." As closing time approached, Eleanor found herself unexpectedly emotional. The day's events, the community's response, and the constant reminders of Frank had worn down her usual composure. She locked the front door a few minutes early and retreated to the office, allowing herself a rare moment of vulnerability. From the small shelf behind the desk, she took down a framed photograph. She and Frank on their 20th anniversary, standing proudly in front of the newly renovated shop. His arm was around her shoulders, his smile broad beneath his salt and pepper mustache. "Quite a day, Frank," she said softly to the image. "Wish you could have seen it." A sharp knock on the shop's back door interrupted her reflection. Eleanor instantly tensed, her hand moving toward the drawer where she kept her personal sidearm. No one used that entrance except regular suppliers, and none were scheduled for today. The security monitor showed a tall, elegantly dressed man in his 60s standing calmly at the delivery entrance. He was alone, his hands visible and empty, his posture non-threatening. Eleanor didn't recognize him immediately, but something in his bearing triggered her instincts. This wasn't a casual visitor. She activated the intercom. "We're closed. Please use the front entrance during regular business hours." The man smiled slightly, looking directly at the concealed camera. "Mrs. Blackwood, I believe we have mutual interests to discuss. I would prefer a private conversation away from prying eyes." His voice confirmed what Eleanor had already suspected from his appearance. Marcus Vega had decided to handle the situation personally rather than sending intermediaries. It was both unexpected and deeply concerning. High-level operators like Vega rarely exposed themselves unless the stakes were extraordinary. Eleanor considered her options quickly. Refusing to meet would only delay the inevitable confrontation. Alerting Rivera would trigger a federal response that might drive Vega underground before they could build a case against him. Meeting him alone was risky, but it also presented an opportunity to gather intelligence directly from the source. "One moment," she replied through the intercom. She moved quickly, activating the shop's discreet recording systems and sending a coded text message to Jim Parker, "Unexpected visitor. Standby protocol active." It wasn't a distress call, but would ensure Jim was alert and ready to contact authorities if she failed to send an all-clear within 30 minutes. After tucking her handgun into the concealed holster at the small of her back, Eleanor approached the delivery entrance and opened the heavy security door. Marcus Vega stood exactly as he had appeared on the monitor, relaxed, composed, and impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that spoke of wealth and refinement. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his clean-shaven face tanned from regular sun exposure rather than tanning beds. He looked more like a successful businessman or politician than a crime lord. "Mrs. Blackwood," He greeted her with a slight inclination of his head. "Thank you for seeing me." "Mr. Vega," Eleanor replied, confirming that she recognized him. "This is unexpected." If he was surprised that she knew his identity, he didn't show it. "May I come in? As I said, I believe a private conversation would benefit us both." Eleanor stepped aside, allowing him to enter while maintaining a careful distance. She led him not to the office, but to the shop floor, choosing an area with clear sightlines and multiple exit routes. "I apologize for the unorthodox approach," Vega said, as he surveyed the shop with appreciative eyes. "But circumstances have become rather complicated in the past 24 hours. The arrest of your associates tends to complicate matters," Eleanor observed, watching him carefully. Vega smiled, revealing perfect teeth. "Direct and perceptive. I appreciate both qualities, Mrs. Blackwood." He ran his fingers lightly over a display case containing vintage revolvers. "You have an impressive collection here. Your husband had excellent taste." "You didn't come to discuss firearms," Eleanor said. "What do you want, Mr. Vega?" "Straight to business, then." He turned to face her fully. "The Corelli brothers have created an unfortunate situation through their mishandling of what should have been a routine expansion. Their methods were crude, their assessment of you catastrophically flawed. And now you're here to what? Apologize. Threatened. Make a more sophisticated attempt at extortion." Eleanor kept her tone neutral, professional. Vega chuckled. "None of the above, actually. I'm here to negotiate a resolution that serves both our interests." "I'm listening," Eleanor said, though she maintained her guarded posture. "The Corellis acted without authorization in their approach to your establishment," Vega explained. "My organization has specific protocols for business development, including thorough background research on potential partners. Had they followed procedure, they would have discovered your military background and your husband's intelligence gathering. They would have recognized you as someone to be respected and approached appropriately, not threatened." "You expect me to believe they were acting independently?" Eleanor challenged. "In their methodology, yes. The expansion into Millfield was authorized, but their particular approach was not." Vega straightened his already perfect cuffs. "I don't employ thugs, Mrs. Blackwood. I employ professionals. The Corellis were an experiment in delegation that has clearly failed." Eleanor studied him carefully, noting the subtle signs of authenticity in his body language. He wasn't lying, at least not entirely. "What kind of resolution are you proposing?" "A simple one," Vega replied. "I will withdraw all operations from Millfield completely. No protection rackets, no pressure on local businesses, no presence whatsoever. In exchange, I ask only that you turn over copies of your late husband's intelligence files, the complete set, not just the selections you've provided to the FBI." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "You have sources within federal law enforcement." "I have sources in many places," Vega acknowledged without elaboration. "Your husband's investigations extended far beyond my operations into territories and organizations that could create significant complications for various parties. Those files have considerable value, enough to make Millfield expendable in my business calculations." "And the Corellis?" Eleanor asked. Vega spread his hands in a dismissive gesture. "They failed. Their consequences are their own to bear. I have no intention of interfering with their prosecution." "You're throwing them to the wolves to protect your wider interests," Eleanor observed. "I prefer to think of it as allowing natural selection to take its course," Vega replied with a thin smile. "Incompetence has consequences in any field of endeavor." Eleanor considered the proposal carefully. Vega was offering Millfield protection from his organization's influence, something that would benefit the entire community. In exchange, he wanted information that could potentially destabilize rival criminal enterprises or expose corruption in places Frank had investigated. "What guarantee would I have that you'd honor this arrangement?" she asked. "Words are cheap, Mr. Vega." "Indeed they are," he agreed. "Which is why I'm prepared to offer a more substantial assurance." He removed an envelope from his inner pocket and placed it on the counter between them. "Inside you'll find account details for a trust established in the name of Millfield Community Development, $5 million, to be administered by a board of local business owners for town improvements, small business grants, and educational programs." Eleanor didn't touch the envelope. "Buying the town's silence. Compensating the community for the troubles caused by my employees," Vega corrected smoothly. "Consider it reparation for damaged trust and a demonstration of good faith regarding our arrangement. The funds are clean, routed through legitimate investment vehicles, completely untraceable to me or my interests." "And if I refuse your offer?" Eleanor asked, though she already anticipated the answer. Vega's expression remained pleasant, but his eyes hardened slightly. "Then we find ourselves at an impasse. I cannot allow those files to remain in circulation, potentially destabilizing arrangements that maintain a delicate balance across multiple territories. You would force me to take more direct action, not against you personally, as I respect your capabilities, but against the broader infrastructure of this community." He gestured toward the window, indicating the town beyond. "The Corellis targeted businesses individually. I would be forced to target systems, transportation networks, supply chains, digital infrastructure. Millfield would find itself experiencing a remarkable run of misfortune. Power outages, internet disruptions, delivery problems, banking irregularities." "Punishing innocent people to pressure me," Eleanor said, her tone hardening. "Creating consequences that make cooperation the logical choice," Vega countered. "I take no pleasure in collateral impacts, Mrs. Blackwood. I would greatly prefer our mutual benefit arrangement." Eleanor weighed her options carefully. Frank's files contained valuable intelligence, but much of it was already backed up in secure locations and with trusted contacts. What Vega likely wanted was information on rival organizations that Frank had investigated, information that had little bearing on Millfield's safety but significant impact on criminal power dynamics. "I need time to consider your proposal," she said finally. Vega nodded, unsurprised. "Prudent, you have 24 hours. He produced a business card with a single phone number embossed in silver. "Call this number with your decision by this time tomorrow." As he turned to leave, Eleanor asked one final question. "Why did you come yourself? Someone in your position normally maintains distance and uses intermediaries." Vega paused at the door, considering her question. "Professional courtesy, Mrs. Blackwood. One veteran to another. Some conversations deserve to be conducted directly, between decision-makers rather than proxies." His expression softened momentarily, and perhaps a touch of curiosity. It's not often someone dismantles a local operation so efficiently. After he departed, Eleanor immediately sent the all-clear text to Jim, then contacted Agent Rivera through their secure line. "You're not going to believe who just paid me a visit," she began without preamble. Rivera listened intently as she detailed the conversation with Vega, his proposal, and the implied threats against the town. "This is unprecedented," the FBI agent said when she finished. "Vega never exposes himself like this. No direct meetings, no traceable connections. He's always layers deep in cutouts and proxies." "He considers the situation extraordinary," Eleanor replied. "Frank's files represent a significant threat to his operations and alliances." "Do they really contain that much damaging information?" Rivera asked. "Yes and no," Eleanor said. "Frank documented everything meticulously, but his most sensitive findings were compartmentalized and distributed to trusted contacts, former colleagues, journalists with integrity, digital deadman switches. What Vega doesn't realize is that simply possessing the physical files wouldn't secure the information. "So what's your plan?" Rivera asked. "We could use this opportunity to set up another sting, catch Vega directly this time." Eleanor considered this option but shook her head. He'd anticipate that. He's not the Corellis. He wouldn't walk into an obvious trap. And if we move against him prematurely, without sufficient evidence for conviction, he'll make good on his threats against Millfield. So we play along, give him what he wants. "We give him something he wants," Eleanor corrected. "I'll prepare a modified set of files, enough authentic material to appear genuine, curated to expose certain rivals without compromising ongoing investigations or your informants." Rivera was silent for a moment, processing her suggestion. "That's a sophisticated counterintelligence approach, Mrs. Blackwood." "It's what I was trained to do," she reminded him. "Information management, selective disclosure to shape adversary behavior. Besides, this buys us time to build a stronger case against Vega while protecting Millfield." "I'll need to consult with my superiors," Rivera said. "This goes beyond standard procedure." "Of course," Eleanor agreed, "but we have less than 24 hours to formulate a response. Vega isn't known for extending deadlines." After ending the call with Rivera, Eleanor sat in Frank's chair, considering the risks and potential outcomes of various approaches. The situation had escalated far beyond a simple extortion attempt by local criminals. Now she was navigating a complex conflict between a sophisticated criminal enterprise and federal law enforcement, with her community caught in the middle. She opened the hidden compartment in Frank's desk and removed a small, encrypted external hard drive, the true repository of his most sensitive investigations. The physical files Vega wanted were comprehensive, but represented only the surface level of Frank's work. The digital archives contained the real depth, the connections and patterns that linked seemingly disparate criminal operations across the Northeast. "What would you do, Frank?" she murmured, turning the drive in her hands. She already knew the answer. Frank had always prioritized protecting innocent people over abstract justice or personal vindication. He would have made whatever deal necessary to safeguard Millfield, while finding a way to advance the larger goal of dismantling criminal networks. With renewed determination, Eleanor began compiling the files she would offer Vega, a carefully curated selection that would appear complete, while actually serving multiple strategic purposes. It would be a delicate balance, giving enough to satisfy him while withholding crucial elements that could protect ongoing investigations. As night fell over Millfield, lights burned late in the back office of Blackwood Firearms. Eleanor Blackwood, once again in her element as a strategic intelligence operative, prepared for a negotiation that would determine not just her future, but that of her entire community. Morning brought a flurry of activity to Blackwood Firearms. Eleanor had spent most of the night preparing her counteroffer for Vega, selecting files that would appear comprehensive while strategically omitting crucial information. By dawn, she had assembled what appeared to be Frank's complete intelligence archive, 5 boxes of meticulously organized documents that would impress even the most discerning criminal mastermind. At 7:30 a.m., Agent Rivera arrived with his supervisor, Assistant Director Claudia Menendez, a stern-faced woman with shrewd eyes and the bearing of someone who had navigated decades of bureaucratic battlefields. "Mrs. Blackwood," Menendez greeted Eleanor with a firm handshake. "Agent Rivera has briefed me on your unconventional approach to this situation." Eleanor met the woman's evaluating gaze without flinching. "I understand your concerns, Director. Negotiating with someone like Vega isn't standard procedure." "That's putting it mildly," Menendez replied, accepting the coffee Eleanor offered. "You're proposing to give a major criminal figure sensitive intelligence that your husband gathered over years of investigation." I'm proposing to give him a carefully constructed version of that intelligence, Eleanor corrected. One that appears complete while actually serving our long-term objectives. Rivera spread out the materials Eleanor had prepared on Frank's desk. I've reviewed the compilation, Director. Mrs. Blackwood has been remarkably strategic in her selections. Menendez examined the files with a practiced eye. Explain your reasoning, Mrs. Blackwood. Eleanor indicated specific sections of the compiled documents. These files on the Denali shipping operation will appear damaging to Vega's interests, but the company was actually dismantled in a DEA operation 3 months ago. The principals are in witness protection already. She moved to another section. This information on the Bryant Street territory dispute seems critical, but it's already common knowledge among all the involved parties. Nothing here would give Vega an advantage he doesn't already possess. And these, Menendez asked, pointing to a thick folder labeled Political Connections. Carefully edited, Eleanor explained. The original files contained information on 17 politicians with ties to organized crime. I've included data on only the 4 who are already under investigation by your public corruption unit, while removing any details that might compromise your confidential informants. Menendez raised an eyebrow, impressed despite her initial skepticism. You've put considerable thought into this, but I still have reservations about negotiating with someone of Vega's stature. He doesn't make deals. Unless he comes out ahead. Of course he doesn't, Eleanor agreed. But neither do I. This arrangement buys protection for Millfield while giving us time to build a stronger case against Vega's broader operation. And the $5 million donation to the town, Rivera asked. Clean money would benefit the community, Eleanor said pragmatically. Schools, small businesses, public services, they've all suffered under budget constraints. That said, I have no illusions about Vega's motivation. The money is meant to compromise the town's moral standing, make them unwitting beneficiaries of his criminal enterprise. Menendez considered this, then nodded slowly. I want to be clear about our position, Mrs. Blackwood. The FBI cannot officially sanction any arrangement with Vega. We can't be seen negotiating with criminal enterprises. I understand, Eleanor replied. This would be my personal initiative, with no connection to your investigation. However, Menendez continued, we can monitor the situation and position assets to gather intelligence based on Vega's response. If he incriminates himself during your meeting, you'll be ready, Eleanor finished. The 3 spent the next hour finalizing details of the plan. The FBI would maintain discreet surveillance, but would not intervene unless Eleanor signaled distress. Audio recording devices were concealed on Eleanor's person and throughout the meeting area, designed to capture any incriminating statements Vega might make. After Menendez and Rivera departed, Eleanor opened the shop as usual, though her mind was far from the day-to-day business operations. At precisely noon, she called the number Vega had provided. I've considered your proposal, she said when Vega answered, her voice businesslike and direct. I'm prepared to discuss terms. I'm glad to hear it, Vega replied smoothly. Shall we meet at your shop again? Say 8 p.m. after closing? No, Eleanor countered. Neutral ground. The boathouse at Lakeside Park, 9 p.m. I'll bring the files you want, but I have conditions of my own. There was a brief pause before Vega responded, a hint of amusement in his tone. Setting the terms of engagement, Mrs. Blackwood. Very well. The boathouse at 9. Come alone, naturally. Naturally, Eleanor agreed, ending the call. The choice of location wasn't arbitrary. Lakeside Park offered multiple access routes, limited surveillance coverage from potential Vega associates, and was secluded enough at night to avoid civilian witnesses. The boathouse itself provided controlled sightlines and acoustics that would optimize the FBI's recording equipment. As evening approached, Eleanor prepared methodically. She dressed in dark clothing that allowed freedom of movement while concealing a lightweight Kevlar vest and her personal sidearm. The files were packed in a weatherproof case with a hidden tracking device embedded in the lining. Jim Parker insisted on driving her to the meeting point, his weather-beaten face tense with concern. "I still think this is crazy, Ellie," he said, as they approached the park entrance. "Vega isn't some small-time crook like the Corellis. He's eliminated people for far less than what you're doing." "I know exactly who he is, Jim," Eleanor replied calmly. "I've studied his patterns, his operations, his psychology. He's dangerous but rational. He makes risk calculations, not emotional decisions. And if his calculation says eliminating you is the safest option," Eleanor checked her watch, 8:45 p.m., "then the FBI team will move in and you'll make sure Frank's contingency protocols are activated." She squeezed his arm reassuringly. "But it won't come to that. Vega wants information, more than revenge." Jim reluctantly dropped her at the park entrance, agreeing to maintain position until she texted the all-clear signal. Eleanor walked the winding path toward the lake, her senses alert to any movement or sound that might indicate surveillance or an ambush. The boathouse loomed dark against the night sky, its weathered wooden structure reflected in the still lake water. A single light glowed from inside, casting elongated shadows through the slatted walls. Eleanor approached cautiously, scanning the surrounding area for any sign of Vega's security detail. She entered through the main door, case in hand, to find Vega already seated at a small table that hadn't been there that morning. He wore a dark suit similar to yesterday's, but had added a cashmere overcoat against the evening chill. A second chair waited opposite him, and 2 glasses of amber liquid stood on the table. "Mrs. Blackwood," he greeted her with a slight nod. "Prompt as expected." "Mr. Vega," she acknowledged, remaining standing. "I see you've made yourself comfortable." He gestured to the empty chair. "Negotiations are better conducted in civilized conditions. The Macallan is 18 years old, if you're interested." "I prefer to keep my head clear," Eleanor replied, setting the case on the table but not taking the seat. Vega studied her for a moment, then inclined his head in acceptance. "Direct to business, then. You mentioned conditions?" Eleanor met his gaze steadily, complete withdrawal from Millfield and surrounding communities within a 20-mile radius. No operations, no recruitments, no pressuring local businesses, directly or through intermediaries. "Agreed," Vega said without hesitation. "The area has proven more troublesome than profitable. The fund for the town will be established through a reputable law firm of my choosing, with no conditions attached to the money." Vega smiled slightly. "You don't trust my financial arrangements?" "I prefer transparency where community welfare is concerned." "Very well," he conceded. "Your choice of firm, provided they maintain appropriate discretion." Eleanor placed both hands on the table, leaning forward slightly. "And finally, any retaliation against me, my associates, or anyone connected to this arrangement will void our deal immediately. Frank's complete files, the real ones, not the selection I've brought tonight, will be released to law enforcement agencies, media outlets, and rival organizations throughout the Northeast." Vega's expression remained calm, but his eyes sharpened with interest. A dead man's switch, practical if somewhat dramatic. He sipped his whiskey. "I accept your terms, with one addition of my own. This arrangement remains confidential. No discussions with law enforcement about our agreement." "Agreed," Eleanor said, knowing that the FBI recording devices were capturing every word. Technically, she wasn't discussing anything with law enforcement. They were simply overhearing an independent conversation. Vega gestured toward the case. "May I?" Eleanor pushed it across the table. "Everything Frank compiled on operations across New England. Contact networks, distribution channels, political connections, enforcement hierarchies." Vega opened the case, and began examining the contents with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to evaluating intelligence materials. He spent several minutes sampling documents from each section, his expression revealing nothing. "Your husband was remarkably thorough," he finally commented, closing the case. "These will require careful review." "They took him years to compile," Eleanor said. "I suggest you read the section on the Providence operations first. There have been some concerning developments there recently." It was a calculated reference to information she had specifically included, details about a power struggle within a rival organization that would likely prompt Vega to shift resources toward protecting his interests in that territory, away from Millfield. Vega's eyes flickered with recognition of the implicit value in her suggestion. "I appreciate the recommendation." He reached into his coat and removed an envelope. "As discussed, details for the transfer of funds. Your chosen firm can contact this bank to initiate the process." Eleanor accepted the envelope without opening it. "How soon will your people withdraw from Millfield?" "They already have," Vega replied. "Orders were issued this morning, contingent on our reaching an agreement. I find it expedites compliance when subordinates understand that decisions have already been made." "And the Corellis?" Vega made a dismissive gesture. "Their failure is their problem. My organization has no further interest in their legal difficulties." Eleanor nodded, satisfied with his response. "Then our business is concluded." As she turned to leave, Vega spoke again. "A question, if you'll indulge me, Mrs. Blackwood." She paused, looking back at him. "Your husband's work, your military background, you could have pursued more ambitious paths than running a small-town gun shop. Why choose this life?" It was an unexpected question, tinged with what seemed like genuine curiosity rather than tactical maneuvering. Eleanor considered her answer carefully. "Freedom," she said finally, "to live by my own code, make my own decisions without institutional constraints or competing agendas." Frank felt the same way. Vega nodded slowly, a hint of recognition in his expression. "Not so different from my own motivations, though our codes clearly differ in content." "The difference matters," Eleanor replied. "Good night, Mr. Vega." She walked out of the boathouse into the cool night air, maintaining a measured pace despite the urge to put distance between herself and the criminal mastermind. Only when she reached the park entrance, where Jim waited anxiously in his truck, did she send the all-clear signal to the FBI surveillance team. "It's done," she told Jim as she climbed into the passenger seat. Vega accepted the terms. Jim studied her face in the dim dashboard light. "You think he'll honor the deal?" "For now," Eleanor replied. "It serves his immediate interests, long-term. That's why we have contingency plans." By morning, the news of the Corelli brothers' arraignment dominated local headlines. They faced multiple federal charges, from racketeering to attempted assault, with no sign of legal assistance from their former employer. The brothers' expressions in the courtroom photos conveyed their dawning realization that they had been abandoned by Vega's organization. Eleanor watched the coverage with quiet satisfaction as she prepared to open the shop. The immediate threat to Millfield had been neutralized, though she harbored no illusions about the temporary nature of the victory. Criminal enterprises were like hydras. Cut off one head, and others eventually emerged to replace it. Agent Rivera called mid-morning with an update. "The surveillance team captured everything," he reported. Vega's explicit acknowledgement of controlling criminal operations, ordering subordinates, and awareness of the Corellis' activities. Not enough for an immediate arrest, but significant building blocks for our broader case. "And my edited files?" Eleanor asked. "Will they serve your purposes?" "Beautifully," Rivera confirmed. "The strategic omissions and inclusions you made should redirect Vega's attention exactly where we want it. Our Providence operation will be feeding him carefully selected information over the coming weeks, reinforcing what's in those files." "Good," Eleanor said. "And the town fund?" Clean as far as we can determine, Rivera replied. Vega was telling the truth about that, at least. The money comes from legitimate investment returns, 3 steps removed from any criminal enterprise. Your lawyer can proceed with establishing the trust without legal concerns. After concluding the call, Eleanor stepped onto the shop floor where the morning's first customers were browsing. Among them was Sarah Mitchell, owner of the bakery that had been one of the Corellis' first targets for their protection racket. Eleanor, Sarah greeted her warmly, I wanted to thank you personally. The Corellis' men came by yesterday to return the protection money they'd collected over the past 6 months. Said it was a business decision to cease operations in the area. That's unexpected, Eleanor remarked, though she had anticipated Vega would tie up loose ends cleanly. It's more than that, Sarah continued. It's life-changing for some of us. The Torres family at the corner market were on the verge of closing. The payments were bleeding them dry. Now they're talking about expanding instead. Throughout the day, similar stories emerged from other business owners. The Corellis' operation had been more extensive than Eleanor had realized, affecting dozens of small businesses throughout Millfield. Vega's withdrawal, prompted by her stand against the initial extortion attempt, had liberated the entire economic ecosystem of the town. That evening, Sheriff Dawson stopped by as Eleanor was closing up. I've got news you might find interesting, he said, leaning against the counter. The state police just arrested Jackson Myers, Vincent Corelli's right-hand man. Picked him up trying to leave the country with fake identification. Let me guess, Eleanor said. He's suddenly very interested in cooperating with investigations into his former employers. Dawson chuckled. Got it in one. He's singing like a canary, naming names all the way up the chain. Between his testimony and whatever evidence the FBI has been gathering, the whole network might unravel. Eleanor nodded, satisfied but not surprised. It was the pattern she had observed throughout her intelligence career. Pressure applied strategically to one point in a criminal organization often revealed structural weaknesses throughout the system. After Dawson left, Eleanor locked up and walked the now familiar path to her home. The streets of Millfield seemed different somehow, not just peaceful, but vibrant with possibility. Shops that had been operating under the shadow of extortion now displayed new inventory. The pizzeria on the corner had extended its hours. Even the neglected community park showed signs of recent attention, with freshly planted flowers and repaired benches. Eleanor smiled slightly, acknowledging the unexpected scope of what she had accomplished. She had stood against the Corellis to protect her shop and her husband's legacy, but in doing so, she had liberated an entire community. At home, she poured herself a small glass of Frank's favorite bourbon and settled into her reading chair. From the bookshelf beside it, she took down a leather-bound volume that contained not intelligence reports or tactical assessments, but photographs. Her life with Frank, over 30 years of marriage, their wedding day, the grand opening of the shop, camping trips and quiet evenings, a life built deliberately, choices made consciously, values upheld consistently. We did good, Frank, she murmured, raising her glass in a silent toast. The ringing of her phone interrupted her reflection. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but the area code was familiar. Boston, where Rivera's field office was located. Mrs. Blackwood. The voice belonged to Assistant Director Menendez. I hope I'm not calling too late. Not at all, Director, Eleanor replied. What can I do for you? I wanted to update you personally, Menendez said. Based on the intelligence gathered during your meeting with Vega, combined with Myers' cooperation, we've initiated a coordinated operation against Vega's entire East Coast network. Simultaneous raids are currently underway at 17 locations across 5 states. Eleanor sat up straighter. That's moving considerably faster than expected. Your strategic editing of those files created an unprecedented opportunity, Menendez explained. Vega redirected security resources exactly as you predicted, leaving several key operations vulnerable. We couldn't waste the opening. And Vega himself? In custody as of 20 minutes ago, Menendez said, satisfaction evident in her tone. Arrested at his estate in Connecticut. Initial reports indicate we've seized enough evidence to ensure he won't see freedom again in his lifetime. Eleanor absorbed this news silently. The outcome was better than she had dared hope for, though it meant Vega would likely consider their agreement void once he realized the role she had played in his downfall. I understand this may create security concerns. For you, Menendez continued, reading her silence correctly. We're prepared to offer protective services or relocation assistance if necessary. I appreciate the offer, Director, Eleanor replied, but I have no intention of leaving Millfield. This is my home, my community. I'll handle whatever consequences. Come. After ending the call, Eleanor sat motionless for several minutes, processing the rapid developments. The situation had evolved from a simple extortion attempt to the dismantling of a major criminal enterprise in less than a week. Her military training had prepared her to handle immediate threats, but Frank's legacy had provided the tools to create lasting change. Tomorrow will bring new challenges. Vega's arrest would leave a power vacuum that other criminal elements might seek to fill. The files she had provided him might still be recovered by his associates, potentially exposing Frank's information network. The town fund would need proper governance to ensure it truly benefited those most in need. But those were concerns for tomorrow. Tonight, Eleanor Blackwood allowed herself a moment of quiet triumph. She had protected what mattered, her shop, her town, her husband's legacy, and, in doing so, had reminded herself of capabilities long dormant but never lost. The widow with a hidden arsenal had proven more formidable than anyone expected. 2 weeks after Vega's arrest, life in Millfield had settled into a new rhythm. The Corelli brothers remained in federal custody awaiting trial, their network of enforcers either arrested or fled. Businesses throughout town operated freely, many displaying Millfield's strong signs in their windows, a symbol of community resilience that had emerged spontaneously after news of the criminal organization's collapse spread. For Eleanor, however, the aftermath brought new complexities. Media interest in the widow who fought back had intensified following Vega's arrest and the revelation of his extensive criminal empire. National news outlets had picked up the story, presenting various dramatized versions of events that ranged from mostly accurate to wildly exaggerated. "You should see what they're saying online," Maria Delgado told Eleanor over coffee at the shop before opening hours. The former military police officer had become a more frequent visitor since the confrontation with the Corellis. According to one website, you single-handedly took down 20 armed men using nothing but your late husband's shotgun and sheer determination. Eleanor shook her head, amused despite her general distaste for the attention. People love their hero narratives. The truth is never quite sensational enough. Still, Maria said, the attention has its benefits. Sheriff Dawson mentioned that crime rates have dropped to a 10-year low. Seems like potential troublemakers are thinking twice about targeting Millfield businesses now. Reputation is a powerful deterrent, Eleanor agreed, remembering lessons from her intelligence days. Though I'd prefer if that reputation were tied to community solidarity rather than individual action. The bell above the shop door chimed, interrupting their conversation. Agent Rivera entered, accompanied by a tall man in an impeccable suit, who carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of high-level federal authority. "Mrs. Blackwood," Rivera greeted her, "I hope we're not interrupting. This is Director Samuel Wells from Washington. He specifically requested this meeting." Eleanor assessed the newcomer with practiced neutrality. "Director of what exactly? Agent Rivera?" Wells smiled slightly. Several things, Mrs. Blackwood, most of which come with unwieldy acronyms and unnecessary classifications. May we speak privately? Maria took the hint, finishing her coffee and heading for the door. I'll call you later, Ellie. Don't forget about dinner on Saturday. After Maria departed, Eleanor led the two men to Frank's office. The space had been subtly reorganized over the past weeks, more of her touch now visible in the arrangement, though Frank's presence remained in the weathered desk and the photographs on the wall. I assume this is about Vega, Eleanor said once they were seated, not bothering with preliminaries. Wells nodded appreciatively at her directness. Partially, the operation to dismantle his network has been remarkably successful. 17 high-level arrests, over 40 million in seized assets, and connections to 3 previously unsolved homicides. He studied her with keen interest. Your contribution to this outcome cannot be overstated. I was protecting my business and my town, Eleanor replied evenly. The broader impacts were a beneficial side effect. Indeed, Wells said. Not quite, concealing his skepticism at her modest characterization. Nevertheless, those side effects have resolved problems that federal agencies have been struggling with for years. Director Menendez speaks very highly of your strategic approach to intelligence management. Eleanor glanced at Rivera, who seemed unusually tense. I appreciate the acknowledgement, Director Wells, but I suspect you didn't come from Washington just to deliver congratulations. Wells smiled more genuinely this time, perceptive as reported. No, Mrs. Blackwood, I'm here because the operation has entered a new phase, one that potentially impacts your security situation. You found Vega's black book, Eleanor stated rather than asked. Both men looked startled. Rivera recovered first. How did you... Logical inference, Eleanor explained. Vega was too experienced to keep physical records of his most sensitive operations, but he'd need some system to track his network of informants and compromised officials. Given his age and background, he'd likely use an old-school approach, a physical record kept separate from his main operations. Wells leaned forward, his interest visibly intensified. That's exactly right. A specialized team discovered a hidden safe in his Vermont property yesterday. Inside was a coded ledger containing what appears to be his complete network of informants, including individuals within federal law enforcement, Eleanor finished. Which is why you're concerned about my security. If Vega had sources within the agencies investigating him, those sources might view me as a threat to be eliminated. Rivera looked increasingly impressed, while Wells maintained his professional composure despite his evident surprise at her insights. The situation is fluid, Wells acknowledged. We've implemented immediate countermeasures, placing certain individuals on administrative leave pending investigation. But until we've identified all compromised personnel, there remains a risk. Eleanor considered this information carefully. What are you proposing? Temporary relocation, Wells replied promptly. A secure location with federal protection until the internal security situation stabilizes. Eleanor shook her head firmly. I appreciate the concern, Director, but I'm not leaving Millfield. This community is just recovering from years of criminal intimidation. My departure now would send exactly the wrong message. Mrs. Blackwood, Wells began, his tone shifting toward authoritative. With all due respect, this isn't simply about community morale. We have concrete intelligence suggesting that certain elements of Vega's organization remain operational, specifically his security detail, which operated semi-autonomously. These individuals have the training and motivation to seek retribution. I'm aware of the risk profile, Eleanor replied calmly. Gabriel Torres and his team of 4 specialized contractors, primarily former military with advanced training in covert operations. They handled Vega's most sensitive security concerns and occasionally direct action against competitors. Wells stared at her, momentarily speechless. Rivera looked equally stunned. That information was classified, Wells finally said. Part of an ongoing DEA operation that predates the current case. Eleanor smiled slightly. Frank's network was more extensive than most people realized. He maintained contacts across multiple agencies, trading information when mutual interests aligned. Torres appeared in his files approximately 3 years ago, initially as an unknown associate of Vega's operation, later identified as head of his security detail. Wells and Rivera exchanged glances that communicated volumes about their reassessment of the situation. "Mrs. Blackwood," Wells said with newfound respect, "I think we need to have a more detailed conversation about your husband's intelligence gathering and your own background. But first, let me be absolutely clear. Torres and his team are highly trained professionals with a loyalty to Vega that transcends financial motivation. If they decide to target you as responsible for their employer's downfall, you will be facing a threat level that no civilian should handle alone." "I'm hardly a typical civilian, Director," Eleanor reminded him, "and I've been anticipating this possibility since before I agreed to meet with Vega. My security preparations are already in place." Wells looked skeptical. "Local measures won't be sufficient against operators of this caliber." "My preparations aren't typical either," Eleanor assured him. She rose and moved to the filing cabinet, unlocking a hidden panel to reveal a sophisticated security console. "The shop and my home have been upgraded with military-grade countermeasures. Surveillance covers a 3-block radius, with AI-assisted pattern recognition to identify potential hostiles. Silent alerts connect directly to both local law enforcement and," she glanced significantly at Wells, "federal response teams, based out of the Boston field office." Wells absorbed this information with a mixture of surprise and grudging admiration. "And you implemented these measures independently?" "With assistance from former colleagues," Eleanor acknowledged. "Frank maintained relationships with various security specialists throughout his career. Many owed him favors." "I see." Wells sat back, reassessing the situation. "Nevertheless, I would be remiss in my duty if I didn't insist on supplementing your security arrangements. At minimum, we should establish a covert protective detail." The shop's phone rang, interrupting Wells's proposal. Eleanor checked the caller ID before answering the speaker. "Jim," she greeted her friend, "I'm in a meeting. Is this urgent?" "You could say that," Jim Parker replied, his voice tense. "Just spotted 2 men conducting surveillance of your shop from the coffee place across the street. Military bearing, concealed weapons, communicating via earpieces." Eleanor's expression remained calm, though her mind immediately shifted into tactical assessment. Description: Hispanic male, late 30s, scar along right jawline. Anglo male, early 40s, crew cut, left-handed. Both in civilian clothes, but moving with that distinctive awareness you military types have. They've been photographing the shop exterior and monitoring customer patterns for the past hour. Rivera was already on his phone, speaking quietly but urgently to what Eleanor assumed was a tactical team. Wells had moved to the window, carefully positioning himself to observe the street without being visible from outside. "Gabriel Torres and likely Eric Mercer," Wells confirmed grimly after studying the scene. "2 of Vega's most trusted security operators. They're conducting pre-operational surveillance." Eleanor thanked Jim for the alert and ended the call. "Sooner than expected," she commented, moving to her security console. "I anticipated at least another week before they organized a response team." "They're accelerating their timeline because of our internal investigation," Wells explained. "Torres would have sources inside federal agencies who've alerted him to the discovery of Vega's ledger." Eleanor activated a series of commands on the security system, bringing up detailed surveillance views of the surrounding blocks. "There," she said, indicating a nondescript van parked 2 streets over. their operational vehicle, likely containing their equipment and possibly additional personnel. Wells looked increasingly impressed by her tactical assessment capabilities. Mrs. Blackwood, I think I'm beginning to understand why Director Menendez was so insistent that I meet you personally. He turned to Rivera. Response team ETA? 8 minutes, Rivera replied. They're mobilizing from a training exercise at the county fairgrounds. Eleanor shook her head. Too long. Torres is experienced enough to recognize a converging federal response. He'll withdraw and regroup, making him harder to track. What do you suggest? Wells asked, deferring to her assessment of the situation. We use their operational approach against them, Eleanor said decisively. They expect me to be an unaware target, a civilian shopkeeper, oblivious to their surveillance. We can use that assumption to control the engagement. She outlined her approach quickly, focusing on using Torres' expectations against him while leveraging the FBI's resources for containment rather than direct intervention. Wells listened with growing respect, making only minor adjustments to account for protocol requirements. It's unorthodox, he admitted when she finished, but tactically sound, provided you remain in a secure position throughout. Of course, Eleanor agreed, though all three knew she had no intention of remaining passive if the situation required direct action. The plan proceeded with remarkable efficiency. Eleanor maintained normal business operations, serving the few customers who entered while appearing completely unaware of the surveillance. Rivera coordinated with the FBI tactical team, positioning them to establish a discreet perimeter rather than converging directly on Torres's position. At Eleanor's suggestion, Sheriff Dawson made a scheduled appearance, stopping by the shop as he did most afternoons. His departure was timed to create a predictable security gap that would tempt Torres into accelerating his approach. They're moving, Wells confirmed, monitoring the surveillance feeds from the back office. Torres and Mercer have separated. Mercer is maintaining position at the cafe while Torres is circling around to approach from the alley. Eleanor nodded. Unsurprised, standard two-man reconnaissance becoming operational. Torres will make initial contact to assess security measures while Mercer provides overwatch. She moved to the shop counter, positioning herself where she would appear vulnerable from Torres's approach angle while maintaining access to the concealed security controls beneath the register. The bell above the door chimed as an elderly woman entered. Mrs. Henderson, a regular customer who usually purchased ammunition for her late husband's hunting rifle, which she maintained more out of sentiment than practical use. "Eleanor, dear," Mrs. Henderson greeted her warmly, "I was hoping you might help me with that sight adjustment we discussed last week." Eleanor's tactical awareness registered the incongruent timing immediately. Mrs. Henderson never visited the shop this late in the day, and they had no previous discussion about sight adjustments. Before she could respond, she caught the nearly imperceptible hand signal the elderly woman made, a military recognition code from 2 decades earlier. "Of course, Mrs. Henderson," Eleanor replied smoothly, understanding instantly. "Why don't we step into the range area where the lighting is better?" As they moved toward the back of the shop, Mrs. Henderson's posture shifted subtly, the frail, elderly facade giving way to a more alert, controlled bearing. Once they were out of view from the front windows, she spoke in a completely different voice, clipped, professional, authoritative. "Director Wells called in some additional resources," she explained, removing a small communication device from her purse. "I'm Colonel Rebecca Hayes, retired Special Operations. The director thought you might appreciate assistance from someone with a similar background to yours." Eleanor assessed the woman with new eyes, recognizing the signs of extensive field experience beneath the carefully maintained cover identity. "Beirut, 1986?" she asked, referencing the operation she had mentioned to Rivera. Hayes smiled slightly. "I was your extraction team leader. You probably don't remember. You were unconscious during most of the evacuation. I remember waking up on the transport with the lieutenant arguing with the field medic about proper wound management, Eleanor recalled. That was you? Guilty, Hayes acknowledged. Small world. Now about our current situation. Torres is more impersonal than your initial assessment. 6-person team, not 4. 2 are currently positioned on the rooftop across the street, likely for sniper support. Eleanor absorbed this information quickly. That changes the approach vector, but not the fundamental strategy. We still need Torres to commit to direct engagement before the FBI team moves in. Hayes nodded approvingly. Already coordinated with Wells. We'll maintain the illusion of vulnerability while establishing containment. I've got 3 of my people, positioned as civilians in the surrounding businesses. Your people? Eleanor questioned. Private security firm specializing in high-risk protection scenarios, Hayes explained with a modest shrug. Mostly retired special operations personnel. Director Wells occasionally contracts our services when situations require flexibility beyond standard protocols. Eleanor couldn't help but smile at the familiar euphemism for operations that skirted the edges of official authorization. Frank would have appreciated the approach. The security console on the wall beeped softly, indicating movement in the alley behind the shop. Both women immediately shifted focus, Hayes drawing a compact pistol from her ankle holster while Eleanor activated the rear security camera feed. The monitor showed Torres approaching the back entrance, moving with the practiced caution of someone with extensive tactical training. He carried what appeared to be a delivery package, a common cover for initial approach. Classic infiltration technique, Hayes observed. Establish a non-threatening presence first, assess security measures, then bring in the main team once. The entry point is confirmed viable, Eleanor nodded. Let him make contact. The security system will capture his biometrics for positive identification, and we need him to demonstrate clear intent before federal agents can intervene. They returned to the main shop area, Hayes resuming her elderly customer persona as she examined a display of hunting scopes. Eleanor positioned herself behind the counter, appearing focused on inventory paperwork while maintaining awareness of all approach angles. The back door buzzer sounded moments later. Eleanor checked the security monitor, showing Torres in a delivery uniform, holding a package with professional casualness. She pressed the intercom button. Deliveries are accepted between 9 and 3 only. Please return tomorrow morning. Torres smiled pleasantly at the camera. Sorry for the late delivery, ma'am. This package is marked urgent. Medical supplies that require immediate signature. Your doctor's office sent it directly. It was a clever approach, creating a scenario that most people would accept without question, especially with the medical urgency component. Eleanor had never established a relationship with any local doctor that would result in such a delivery. But Torres was counting on her not wanting to risk refusing important medical items. One moment, Eleanor replied, activating the full biometric. Scan integrated into the delivery entrance. The system immediately confirmed Torres's identity, matching against Frank's files and the FBI database. More importantly, it detected the concealed weapons beneath his uniform, a primary handgun at his waistband and a secondary weapon in an ankle holster. Eleanor pressed the silent alert button, transmitting the confirmed identification and weapons detection to the FBI team. She then made deliberate eye contact with Hayes, who gave an almost imperceptible nod before moving toward the back of the shop, positioning herself out of sight, but with a clear line of fire to the delivery entrance. With practiced calm, Eleanor approached the back door. Through the reinforced glass, she could see Torres waiting patiently, his posture relaxed but ready, the stance of a predator confident in his approach. "Who's the package from?" she asked through the intercom, adding an appropriate note of confused concern to her voice. "Dr. Michaels at Millfield Medical Associates." Torres replied smoothly. "It's your prescription renewal. He mentioned it was urgent." The fabricated doctor's name confirmed her suspicions beyond any doubt. Eleanor pressed a second button on the security panel, activating the specialized countermeasures Frank had installed throughout the shop. "I don't have a Dr. Michaels," she told Torres through the intercom, dropping the confused act. "And I don't have any prescriptions, Mr. Torres." The change in Torres' demeanor was immediate and dramatic. The friendly delivery person vanished, replaced by the hardened operative beneath. His hand moved toward his concealed weapon, but Eleanor was already activating the final security protocol. From hidden compartments throughout the delivery area, pressurized nozzles released a fast-acting but non-lethal incapacitating agent. The same compound she had used against the Corellis' hired muscle, but deployed more efficiently in the contained space. Torres recognized the danger instantly, attempting to retreat, but the security door had already sealed the delivery alcove into an isolated containment area. Within seconds, Torres was unconscious on the floor of the sealed compartment, the package falling beside him. Through the security monitors, Eleanor watched as the FBI tactical team simultaneously moved on the surveillance van and the cafe position, apprehending Mercer and 2 additional team members without incident. The rooftop snipers, seeing their team compromised, attempted to withdraw, but found their exit routes blocked by Hayes' operatives, who had quietly secured the building's access points during the operation. "Textbook counter-surveillance operation," Hayes commented, resuming her normal voice as she holstered her weapon. "Just like the Azerbaijan situation in '89, though with considerably better equipment." Eleanor smiled at the reference to another shared operational history. "And fewer diplomatic complications." Director Wells and Agent Rivera entered from the front of the shop, having coordinated the FBI team's movements from their mobile command position. 6 high-value targets in custody, including Torres himself, Wells reported, genuine admiration in his tone. "Mrs. Blackwood, I must say your security setup is impressively comprehensive for a small-town gun shop." Eleanor shrugged slightly. "Frank believed in being prepared. I simply maintained and updated his systems." Wells exchanged a meaningful glance with Hayes before addressing Eleanor directly. "In light of today's events, I'd like to revisit our earlier conversation. Not about relocation, I understand your position on that, but about your potential involvement in an advisory capacity." "Advisory?" Eleanor questioned. "We're establishing a specialized task force to dismantle the remainder of Vega's network and address the compromised personnel identified in his ledger," Wells explained. "Your insights into his operation, combined with your husband's intelligence, materials, and your own analytical capabilities, would be invaluable. Strictly consulting, of course. You wouldn't need to leave Millfield." Eleanor considered the proposal thoughtfully. The idea of returning to intelligence work, even in a limited capacity, stirred long-dormant professional instincts. Yet she valued the independence she had found in Millfield, the community connections, and the meaningful purpose of continuing Frank's legacy through the shop. "I'll consider it," she said finally. "Under certain conditions regarding operational autonomy and information sharing." Wells nodded, clearly having expected nothing less. "I wouldn't have it any other way. Your unorthodox approaches clearly yield results that conventional methods miss." As the FBI team secured Torres and processed the scene, Eleanor stepped outside, onto the sidewalk, watching as life in Millfield continued largely undisturbed around the carefully contained operation. Across the street, Sarah from the bakery waved cheerfully, unaware of the dramatic confrontation that had just unfolded. Down the block, the Torres family's market was busy with afternoon shoppers. The town hall's clock chimed 5 o'clock. Its familiar tone marking the rhythm of small-town life that continued despite the day's extraordinary events. Eleanor took a deep breath of the crisp evening air, feeling a profound sense of satisfaction. What had begun as a simple refusal to pay protection money had evolved into something far more significant. Not just the dismantling of a criminal network, but the reclaiming of her own capabilities and purpose. The widow, with the hidden arsenal, had not only protected her shop and her town, but had found a new path forward, one that honored Frank's legacy while embracing her own unique strengths. Whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, Eleanor Blackwood would face them with the same quiet determination and strategic brilliance that had transformed a moment of vulnerability into an unexpected triumph. 3 months after Torres's capture, Millfield celebrated its annual Founders' Day with unprecedented enthusiasm. The town square bustled with activity, food vendors, craft displays, and live music creating a festive atmosphere that reflected the community's renewed spirit. At the center of it all stood a newly constructed gazebo, funded by the first disbursement from the Millfield Community Trust, the legitimate name given to the fund established with Vega's money. Eleanor watched the celebration from a comfortable distance, seated at a small table outside the cafe across from her shop. Though many townspeople had tried to make her the guest of honor, she had politely declined, preferring to observe rather than be observed. "Not one for the spotlight, are you?" Sheriff Dawson commented as he joined her with 2 cups of coffee. "Never have been," Eleanor replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "The community deserves the credit for this revival, not me." Dawson chuckled. "That's not how they see it. Half the businesses in town have signs in their windows now. We don't pay protection money here. It's become a point of pride." Eleanor smiled slightly. "A healthier community stance than fear and compliance." "Speaking of community stances," Dawson said, his tone shifting to something more serious, "the town council unanimously approved your proposal last night. The Millfield Security Cooperative launches next month." This news brought genuine satisfaction. The cooperative had been Eleanor's idea, a program to help local businesses implement basic security measures and create a community-wide alert system. It transformed the isolation that had made businesses vulnerable to extortion into a collective strength. "Good," she nodded. "Sarah Mitchell and Roberto Torres have agreed to co-chair the initiative. They understand firsthand how important it is." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Agent Rivera, looking remarkably casual in jeans and a light jacket, a stark contrast to his usual pressed suits. "Mrs. Blackwood," he greeted her with a warm handshake. "Sheriff, hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," Eleanor assured him. "Coffee?" Rivera declined with a small gesture. "Just stop by to deliver some news personally." He sat at their table, lowering his voice slightly. "The Corelli brothers accepted a plea deal yesterday. They're providing detailed testimony on Vega's entire East Coast operation in exchange for reduced sentences." "How reduced?" Dawson asked, professional concern evident in his tone. "Still substantial," Rivera assured him. 15 years minimum, but their information is proving invaluable. We've already identified 3 previously unknown distribution networks and 12 compromised officials across 4 states. Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. "And Torres?" "Not talking yet," Rivera admitted, "but his team has been less loyal. Between their testimony and the evidence recovered from Vega's properties, we've dismantled approximately 70% of his organization." The conversation shifted to more general updates on the ongoing investigations, with Rivera sharing what he could without breaching confidentiality. As they talked, Eleanor noticed a familiar figure approaching from across the square, Colonel Hayes, now dressed as an ordinary tourist rather than the elderly Mrs. Henderson. "Looks like my cue to get back to the festivities," Dawson remarked, recognizing the colonel from the debriefing after Torres's capture. "Eleanor, don't forget the committee meeting on Tuesday." After the sheriff departed, Hayes claimed his vacant chair. "Sorry to interrupt your coffee break," she said without preamble, "but Director Wells asked me to deliver this personally." She handed Eleanor a sealed envelope. "The official offer we discussed." Eleanor accepted the envelope, but didn't open it immediately. "He could have mailed it." "He could have," Hayes agreed with a slight smile, but he wanted to emphasize how seriously the Bureau takes this opportunity. "Not everyone gets a personal courier with my credentials." Rivera nodded in confirmation. "The director has fast-tracked everything. The security clearances, the consultation parameters, all approved at the highest levels." Eleanor studied the envelope thoughtfully. Inside was an offer to serve as a special consultant to the FBI's newly formed Criminal Network Disruption Task Force, a position that would allow her to continue living in Millfield while contributing her expertise to dismantling operations similar to Vega's throughout the Northeast. "The task force has already incorporated several of your strategic recommendations," Hayes added. "The results have been impressive. And your security firm has nothing to do with their implementation, I'm sure," Eleanor commented with knowing irony. Hayes smiled enigmatically. "Let's just say there's been productive collaboration between public and private resources." Eleanor finally opened the envelope, scanning the official documents within. The terms were essentially as discussed: part-time consultation, operational autonomy, and a classification structure that would protect both her privacy and sensitive information. What surprised her was the security clearance level, higher than she had held even during her military intelligence career. "This is generous," she acknowledged. "It's practical," Rivera countered. "Your approach to the Vega situation demonstrated exactly the kind of unconventional thinking we need. Criminal networks are evolving. Our responses need to evolve faster." Eleanor tucked the documents back into the envelope. "I'll need time to review everything carefully." "Of course," Hayes agreed, rising from her chair. "The director expected nothing less. I'll be in town until tomorrow if you have questions." She glanced around the bustling town square. "Though I can see why you might be reluctant to leave all this behind. The position wouldn't require relocation," Rivera reminded her. "True," Hayes conceded, "but once you're back in the game, priorities have a way of shifting." After Hayes departed, Rivera lingered, watching Eleanor with perceptive eyes. "You're concerned about more than just the terms of the agreement," he observed. Eleanor nodded, appreciating his insight. The shop was Frank's dream. Taking on this role, even part-time, would mean shifting focus. "What would Frank want?" Rivera asked quietly. The question hit home more powerfully than elaborate arguments could have. Eleanor gazed across the square. At Blackwood Firearms, the shop that had been the center of her life since Frank's death, it represented security, continuity, and a tangible connection to the man she had loved. Yet Frank himself had never been content with mere security or continuity. He had constantly sought ways to make a difference, to use his skills where they mattered most. "He'd tell me to do what I do best," she answered finally, "and remind me that shops can be managed, but skills and knowledge should be used." Rivera smiled, understanding the significance of her response. "For what it's worth, we've already discussed how to support the continued operation of Blackwood Firearms. Jim Parker has expressed interest in managing day-to-day operations, with you maintaining ownership and oversight." Eleanor raised an eyebrow, surprised at the thoroughness of their planning. "You've thought of everything." "We try to," Rivera acknowledged, "though I should mention that no one involved in this proposal expected the outcome of your confrontation with the Corellis. We're still playing catch-up to your strategic thinking." That evening, after the Founders' Day celebration wound down, Eleanor returned to her home with the proposal in hand. She settled into her reading chair by the window, the documents spread across her lap. Outside, Millfield had returned to its quiet evening rhythm, families walking home from the square, the distant sound of music from the town's only bar, the comforting normality of small-town life at peace. On the table beside her sat two photographs, one of her and Frank on their wedding day, young and full of possibility, the other taken at the shop's grand opening, both of them proud of what they had built together. Between the frames lay Frank's old service pistol, which he had carried throughout the confrontation with Vega's organization. Eleanor picked up a pen, tapping it thoughtfully against the acceptance page of the FBI's proposal. The events of the past months had awakened something she had almost forgotten, the satisfaction of using her full capabilities, of making a difference beyond the boundaries of everyday life. The Corellis had seen only a vulnerable widow when they walked into her shop demanding protection money. They had failed to recognize the arsenal hidden behind her quiet demeanor, not just weapons and security systems, but intelligence, training, and strategic brilliance honed through years of service. Their mistake had cost them everything while giving Eleanor something unexpected, a second chapter she hadn't anticipated. With decisive strokes, she signed the acceptance document, committing herself to this new path. The widow with the hidden arsenal would now use those capabilities to ensure that operations like Vega's found no safe haven in any community. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new adversaries, and new strategies. But tonight, Eleanor Blackwood sat in peaceful satisfaction, knowing that what had begun as a simple refusal to be victimized had evolved into something much more significant. A return to purpose, a recommitment to using her extraordinary skills where they were most needed. Frank would have approved, and in the end, that mattered more than all the formal proposals in the world. Up next, you got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.